All right, joining us momentarily would be Professor Harsh Pant to inform you, the viewer, about the ongoing visit of India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi to Brunei. He'll be joining us in a moment, but let's get you some more details about India-Brunei relations at this point in time while we wait for the guest to join us. Prime Minister Modi's visit is, as we've been reporting, the first bilateral visit by an Indian Prime Minister to Brunei. It's on the occasion of 40 years of diplomatic ties between the two countries. All right, joining us at this moment is Professor Harsh Pant. Professor Pant, welcome to DD India News Hour. Professor Pant is Vice President Studies and Foreign Policy at Observer Research Foundation. The ORF is a privately held think tank headquartered in New Delhi. Professor Pant, for the benefit of viewers joining us from around the world, what can you tell us about Brunei in terms of its history, geography, politics, economy and people?
Ramesh, this is, Brunei has been or continues to be a very, very important part of the Southeast Asian landscape for India. And as India has managed to look at Southeast Asia through first an economic and then through a strategic prism, Brunei has emerged also as a very important anchor in the kind of imagination that India has for the region and beyond the region, of course, for the wider Indo-Pacific. And I think what we are now looking when we look at Brunei, today, when we look at this being the first bilateral visit by an Indian Prime Minister, it also underscores how far the relationship has traveled from being, one of the smaller countries in the Southeast Asian landscape to Brunei emerging as an independent actor in the Southeast Asian landscape, both in terms of what it is doing with its economy, in terms of the role that it is playing as an autonomous player, and also increasingly looking for India as a defense partner. So the relationship now spans the entire gamut, from a relationship that started off for India, India-Brunei relationship that started off primarily being a relationship with another of Southeast Asian countries, to today Brunei being a very pivotal country in the region, which both strategically and economically is becoming very, very important. And we are also celebrating, of course, 40 years of our diplomatic ties. So it is very pertinent that Prime Minister goes there at this very important juncture.
Indeed. Now that you've given our viewers an overview, Professor Pant, I want to delve into certain specifics. To begin with, how does Brunei fit into India's relations with Southeast Asia as a whole? In other words, where does India see Brunei insofar as its Act East policy and vision of the Indo-Pacific are concerned?
So as you know, Ramesh, we have, from India's perspective, we have looked at Southeast Asia as a very, very critical player in our Indo-Pacific imagination. As this idea of Indian Ocean and Pacific Oceans being one contiguous maritime zone has become the central feature of international relations, India's engagement with Southeast Asia has grown through that lens. India's relations, of course, with Southeast Asia has been very traditional, historic, civilizational, but in the contemporary context, in the strategic context, Southeast Asia, ASEAN, for example, is central to India's Indo-Pacific policy, ASEAN centrality, as we call it, in our foreign policy. So ASEAN centrality is critical in that regard. And if you look at what is happening within ASEAN, ASEAN is under pressure from multiple vantage points. ASEAN is facing the pressure of US-China geopolitical contestation. ASEAN is facing the pressure of slowing down of global economy. ASEAN is facing the pressure of divisions within ASEAN members themselves on issues, say the maritime disputes and South China Sea dispute. So I think at this point, individual states in Southeast Asia are looking at multiple partnerships like the one Brunei is forging with India. It is not simply a partnership through ASEAN. It is also a standalone partnership.
True.
That Brunei is now looking at India through, and India is reciprocating because India has enormous stakes in the way Brunei shapes up and in the way ASEAN shapes up.
Indeed, as you say, Professor Pant, India-Brunei ties have a logic of their own. They stand, on their own legs, so to speak. In that context, is there scope for doing more on the bilateral front, be it in terms of trade, investment, security perhaps?
Absolutely, and I think that's where this visit will play such an important role, because traditionally our prism had been through ASEAN. The ASEAN lens was used to engage Brunei, and I think time has now come to also look at Brunei, as you mentioned, through its own lens, through the lens of Brunei being such a critical player, a Brunei where the economy is doing relatively well, and a Brunei that is increasingly willing to take independent stance on issues. This is not the Brunei of the past. This is a Brunei that is increasingly venturing into defense ties with India. So I think we have started off primarily looking at Brunei through an economic lens. We have now moved to the defense space where we are doing a lot of activity together. And I think this visit will further take this relationship into areas like social sector, like health, like space and critical technologies, and of course, enhancing people-to-people engagement so that Brunei and India's relationship can become even more significant as India looks at India-ASEAN relationship and tries to build on some of these independent relationships, of course, as part of the wider ASEAN framework, but also bilateral frameworks. So as I think what this visit will signify is that the first 40 years of India-Brunei relationship have laid the foundations of a very independent relationship, and the next 40 years perhaps will lay the foundations of an emerging strategic partnership, increasingly in those sectors where we have not really ventured so far. And I think the template that India will be following is where Prime Minister goes from Brunei, which is Singapore, which is again something that is going to be critical.
I'll come to Singapore if time permits, Professor Pant, but talking a bit more at length on India-Brunei ties. As you mentioned, we've spoken about the 4 decades of diplomatic ties. Now, India and Brunei, as you mentioned, are celebrating 40 years of diplomatic relation. Why do you think it's taken us so long for an Indian Prime Minister to make a bilateral visit to Brunei?
Well, I think it's unfortunate. And I think partly it is, Ramesh, because as I was mentioning, our whole focus had been to look at Southeast Asia through the ASEAN lens. We have been very, very focused on investing in ASEAN as a central pillar of our Act East policy, of our first Look East and then Act East policy. And ASEAN members collectively have been a very important partner. Where I think today we are looking at India's relationship diversifying in the region. If you just look at the last few weeks, what we have seen is a visit by the Vietnamese leaders, a visit by the Malaysian Prime Minister. We have seen the visits, now the Prime Minister visiting Singapore and Brunei. There is a disaggregation happening in our approach to the Southeast Asia, which is, I think, a good thing, a very welcome step. And perhaps the most significant development will be this visit to Brunei, because Brunei had been one country where, despite being part of ASEAN and despite India having an overall very friendly relationship with most ASEAN member states, Brunei had been kept aside. We had not really invested in as much as I think was needed. And now, as countries like Brunei are looking at getting out of this US-China contestation, they have, of course, good partnership with the US, good partnership with China. But I think they are looking for countries like India to give them that leverage, which can also take them forward in terms of their engagement with these two big players. And India fits the bill. India is not camp follower of any country. India follows a strategic autonomy. And I think that's where Brunei, a country like Brunei, is very interested in looking at India, both as an economic partner, as a strategic partner, and also a partner that can help alleviate some of the concerns that some of the member countries of ASEAN are facing, as ASEAN itself becomes a relatively weak and a divided organization. So I think the prospects are very bright, and Prime Minister, by choosing Brunei, is also signaling that we will continue to invest in ASEAN, but we will also invest doubly on individual members, which continue to retain their own relevance in the larger scheme of things as ASEAN becomes so critical to the wider Indo-Pacific debate.
All right. Professor Pant, thank you for joining us and sharing your thoughts and insights with our viewers at home and abroad. Thank you for your time. Much appreciated.